Anxiety-based drive for control. Today, we are talking all about PDA, or pathological demand avoidance. I have been seeing a lot of talk about PDA over on Instagram land, and boy, do those posts get a lot of engagement. And I was on my crusade, last year I presented at 12 conferences, did my first keynote. It was a big year. It's a big year for me because I used to be afraid of public speaking. And I was at the Autism New Jersey conference. I did a talk about the power of joint attention and had a booth. I was not able to see our presenters present on that particular day because I was at my booth. But afterwards, I was going through the Autism New Jersey book and I saw this talk and I thought, I have to reach out. I have to have both of these presenters on. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Michael Selbst and Dr. Jeniffer Cruz. We're talking all about PDA. What does that mean? What is the profile? How important collaboration over compliance is. If you've heard of PDA, if you have a student who has anxiety when triggers are presented, you will want to listen to this podcast in the entirety. Thank you so much to both of our speakers today. This is a great, great conversation.
I'm Rose Griffin, a speech therapist, board-certified behavior analyst, and founder of ABA Speech. It wasn't all that long ago that I felt overwhelmed by providing therapy for my autistic students and any students who were not yet speaking. Fast forward through many doubts, tears, research, and courses, and you will see the framework that I use today and share with over 60,000 readers weekly. One that will help you support your students and feel more confident in the process. I created the ABA Speech podcast to give you simple, step-by-step strategies to help you reach all of your students wherever they are on their communication journeys. If you're a speech therapist, BCBA, RBT student, or parent who's looking to help all students develop a way to communicate with the world, you are in the right place, friend. Let's get started.
Welcome to the show today. I am very excited about this topic. I'm going to be learning right along with you. Today we have with us Dr. Michael Selbst and Jeniffer Cruz. Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Looking forward to it.
I found out about actually way after the fact. I mean, we were actually in the same location, but I didn't meet you then. I was on this whole thing last year. I got asked to do a keynote at this really cool conference in Greenville, South Carolina that I did last April. But prior to that, I was like, I need to present in person to get ready for my first keynote, which took place. I do a ton of virtual presenting, but to present in person is like a whole different, you guys just did it too. It's so you got to command the front of the room. It's a whole thing. So last year I went to 12 conferences and I, either got paid to present or presented and got a booth. And so at Autism New Jersey, where we were all at the same conference, I did this cool talk on joint attention, which was fun. And you guys presented, but I had a booth. So of course, when you have a booth, you can't go to any talks. So after the fact, I'm doing my good things and going through, and I was like, oh, this looks like a good topic. So I reached out to you and thank you for coming on the show because, we just met. But I'm sure that you had a lot of people in your room for this talk because today we're going to be talking about pathological demand avoidance. PDA is what I feel like it's referred to. I see it a lot on, or when I do see it, I've seen it talked about on Instagram. That's kind of the world that I live in and sharing and disseminating information. But can you describe for people what that means if people have not heard that term before?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I just kind of piggybacking on what you mentioned. So when Dr. Cruz and I were considering this topic in preparation for Autism New Jersey, it was usually the proposals come out about 6 or 9 months ago. They want us to submit. And we had a sense that this would be a much more hot topic than it was at the time that we were presenting. So we kind of pitched it that while this isn't necessarily very well known now, we have a feeling that people are going to be coming to this conference and kind of clamoring at the different autism workshops, wondering what is PDA all about. So we really just kind of jumped into that and said, let's get into the research. Let's talk about that. Let's have some understanding. So Dr. Cruz and I had the pleasure of presenting, and at Autism New Jersey, as you know, it's hard to predict how many people will be in any particular room. And, I think it was a good problem to have, if you want to put it that way, that it was jam-packed. So
Oh,
standing room only,
okay.
which we're certain was related to the topic. It was fun and, real engaging because there are lots of questions and people coming up afterward. And but to think about pathological demand avoidance, and it's also referred to as escape demand avoidance, maybe a little bit kinder term than the pathological part of it. In many ways, it's the individual that we may already know, but really sheds some light on that perspective. So if we think about an individual that perhaps historically was described as oppositional defiant disorder, not that we would describe someone by name, but presenting with those symptoms, I would say that we really need to have a lot of caution, because this is the kind of individual who commonly would meet symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, although they don't need to, but it is being described as a subtype, not yet in the DSM, not in the ICD, but a subtype seen in England, UK, and in Australia at the moment, not yet, again, in the United States, but someone who has, again, a lot of those characteristics of autism, but has a great deal of anxiety responding when triggers are present. So when there's any kind of demand, it could be an explicit demand, like please go pick up your clothes, or please get your book bag, or go face these items in a supermarket, presented with a demand that's explicit, or perhaps more implied, like, hey, what do you think we should do today? Or implied where they're walking in a social situation and thinking, I'm supposed to make eye contact or talk with someone, that the presence of demands for that individual evokes a great deal of anxiety, which significantly increases their arousal level, that becomes kind of an onset or trigger for a great deal of discomfort. And when there's discomfort, particularly if the discomfort is elevated, then that results in that fight, flight, freeze, or sometimes kind of fawn response. And for many individuals, that can really evoke some significant responses. Sometimes we see that aggression or shutting down. And so I think as clinicians, that can help us, and for parents too, and educators, help us to really pause, step back, and to reconsider how we might intervene, how we might respond to those significant behavioral responses.
So that's interesting. So why do you think that? Because PDA, I know, Jeniffer, are you a BCBA as well? I know, Michael, you're a BCBA.
I'm not, no.
You're not. Okay. Kind of like I'm a speech therapist and BCBA. There's like less than 400 of us in the world. And I'm like, well, I saw some people that have hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram talking about PDA, but I know that it's not in the DSM yet and things like that. So I'm like, well, is it real? And then I saw that you guys are presenting on it. And I'm just wondering, do we know why it's not an actual diagnosis, or why it's not something in the United States yet? Do you think, Michael, that might be something down the road? Because I know anytime it's talked about, people just are like hungry for information, because they're like, I made one post about it last week. I remixed this. David Coe is a parent to an autistic child, and he has good information on there. And people were just commenting. I was like, we're going to be talking about this on the podcast, and everybody is sharing about it. And why do we think it's not included yet? Do we think it will be down the road?
Well, I think it's early. So if we think
early,
about
okay.
How Asperger's syndrome started,
Yeah.
it wasn't a diagnosis and considered like a subtype. And we think about research. So there unfortunately isn't the research yet. So when we consider and talk further about strategies, there aren't yet evidence-based strategies specifically for PDA. Yet we know that there are evidence-based strategies to treat the presenting kinds of issues, just not the specific subtype. So I think a lot of it has to do with that the research is still very emerging. That's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And there aren't clear ways to definitively give the subtype, in part because the subtype doesn't exist. So it's a little bit of, circulatory reasoning here. But I would imagine that it's going to pick up more and more steam, and perhaps it'll be a subtype, which may be helpful, to have some greater understanding. Yet we absolutely have to exercise some caution to be careful about names and labels and so forth. So while it's new in terms of a subtype, if you will, in the other countries that we talked about, it's also not new in terms of the description of an individual. I think
Mm-hmm.
what it gives us is some greater understanding and perspective. And that's ultimately most important, more important than a diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. So is that what we're talking about some of the characteristics of PDA? Is that one of the main ones that there's this level of anxiety with so anxiety when triggers are presented, is that one of the main characteristics, or what are some of the others that are included?
I'll pass this to Dr. Cruz. You want
Yeah.
to chat about that for a moment?
Yeah. So it's sort of characterized, or seems to be characterized, as this anxiety-based sort of drive for control. So there's this sense of, in your everyday, that's why the different demands, it can be demands that are explicit, placed by other people, or even demands that are just things like routines, or just basic requests from other people, or even some internal demands like needing to go to the bathroom or needing to get a drink. And it's this sense that individuals with this PDA profile have really highly sensitive nervous systems. And so anything that's perceived as a lack of, or a removal of control is really challenging. So that's one of those kind of overarching characteristics that we kind of see with folks in with this profile.
Interesting. Okay, because I know everybody that was, commenting on my post, and now I'm thinking back to kids that do. This is a very different type of profile. Like if I'm a general school-based speech language pathologist and I'm seeing, everybody, right, free and appropriate education, I might be seeing students who are using AAC devices who are not yet speaking. But I'm thinking back to kids who I struggled with personally to provide intervention that kind of presented like this, where I like that anxiety-based drive for control. I think everybody that's listening is like, oh yeah, I know that kid, right? And sometimes when you feel like you're not confident with that type of learner, you feel kind of like, where do I go for information, right? If this is something new that people are talking about. So immediately I would love to talk about, what characteristics need to be present for intervention, because I feel like it's probably something different. I know I'm thinking back to a kid many, many moons ago who definitely had this need for controlling the situation when I was like really young. And I know that type of learner, when I would go see him, I was always kind of like, nervous. You know what I mean? Like, what's going to happen in this? This is before I was a BCBA. I'm not sure that would even help, but I'm still like, oh my gosh, what do we do for this particular student? Because it didn't fall into like what I was doing with my other students, right? It's a very different type of profile than somebody who's maybe not yet speaking, who's trying to find a way to communicate with the world. So what characteristics need to be present for intervention for a student who may have this type of PDA profile?
Well, I think for one, at least when I view this, a part of the reason I think what you're describing too is that what we typically know, or how we sort of frame certain behaviors as either like defiant or in that realm, we have a set of interventions that we typically try to use. And so when we're thinking about individuals with this presentation, so what is it that we're looking for? So we're looking for individuals who really struggle with even the most basic of tasks or demands on the regular. And I often think of things that we might typically use as interventions, so positive reinforcement and things like that, where that's not really working. So it's also looking at the interventions that aren't as effective, and determining if part of that is related to this feeling of anxiety, or it feels as though this is a demand that's being placed on me, even if it seems very implicit in nature.
I would piggyback on that. I think part of when we look at things behaviorally, as Dr. Cruz talked about with reinforcement procedures, contingency management. If you do this, then this will happen. Or
Right.
you can earn 5 tokens and then you have the access to this reinforcement. There's a level of control there by adults, and there's demands implied there. Even if, hey, clean your room and then this will happen. Well, okay, that sounds great, but you're still asking me to do something, and you're the presence, the awareness of that level of control, which is anxiety producing. And Rose, when you commented about like what Jen said regarding anxiety driven control, I think we can all relate to that when we have a level of uncertainty. And I always like to bring that back to what is our own experience. So when we're feeling uncertain and unsettled, we want to exert some level of control, whether it's catastrophes, whether it's managing our own behavior or managing our child's behavior or student in our classroom. that all really kind of contributes to it. So a lot of the way we want to think about working with an individual who presents with this profile is to get into a lot more of collaborative kind of work. So we're going to work toward cooperation versus compliance. We're going to work toward collaborative problem solving. So we're going to do this together. Hey, let's look at all these clothes on the floor. Look at all these dirty dishes that are in the sink. What do you think we should do? Which is a much different spin than, all right, what's your chore? You need to go clean up the dishes, or remember, you need to pick up your dirty laundry. So we're joining them more. So it's less feeling of a coercive process. So you're not coercing me, but you're joining in with me. And that maybe help the individual to be less inclined to feel like someone's telling them, directing them what to do. There's also a lot of indication thus far about having a sense of humor, which we say with some caution, because while that can be beneficial, we also know that many individuals with autism don't really get a good sense of like metaphors and similes and a sense of different parts of speech and so forth. So when someone's being silly or humorous, they may not pick up on that. So you have to be mindful of that too. But a lot of it is, again, how we present what the expectations are, and really tapping into what's meaningful, what's maybe value-based for that individual, and engaging a lot more collaboration versus trying to, as adults, exert our control. Because what we're really communicating to the individual, whether child or adult, is that what I want matters more than what you want. And I'm going to try to get you to do what I want. And well, how does that make somebody else feel? They're going to perhaps push away, push toward, or freeze, or kind of drop to what you want. And that doesn't necessarily create the kind of individual we want either.
Yeah, I love that. That is really difficult. I feel like it sounds amazing, but I would imagine that it's probably hard. Sometimes, I mean, I've had a lot of administrative and consulting roles, so I feel like it's probably really hard to convey. Like, I love all this. I'm like, yes, I'm thinking about other kids I've worked with that where I would do more collaborative. Like, I had a student that I worked with in a non-public program who was very conversational, but had a lot of these characteristics that you're describing. And I remember one thing that we did that was really collaborative is this person had a phrase chart. So when they got really elevated behaviorally and had very unsafe problem behavior, and they were in a separate facility for their education, we came up with a phrase chart together that this student could like use, during times of distress so that she wouldn't get amped up to that. And so I think this is really, it sounds like extremely nuanced, because I think sometimes, like as a consultant role that I've been in, trying to convey that this is what people need to do to reach this type of learner, it's probably, do you feel like it's hard to convey this information to teachers and to other staff? It seems like it might be, you kind of have to market it. It seems like some people are in that antiquated way of like, I'm the adult, it's school, I say you do something, you do it. Do you feel like you get some kind of pushback when you're consulting and trying to convey this type of intervention?
I think it's interesting how you say it. I think we don't want people to, I guess, to respond based just on an innate response. We want them to have a good educational mindset when they're approaching things. That being said, I think that as we know that just like we say, if you've seen one individual with autism, you've seen one individual with autism. If you've seen one educator or one BCBA, we could kind of say the same thing, that we all kind of have our own different colored glasses. For example, when I'm going into a school, I'm thinking about independence continuously, and how do we promote independence? How do we promote communication coming from within for that individual, and minimizing prompt dependence? So when I think about helping folks to support an individual who presents with a PDA profile, I'm thinking non-confrontation, thinking about mindful about, again, that cooperation over compliance. So when you hear certain phrases that somebody might say, like, you need to do this, or you don't have a choice, they become kind of trigger words for me, where I'm thinking, oh gosh, let's be wondering and watching what's going to happen next. Because if you're telling somebody they have to do something and they have no choice, now you've immediately removed their power versus empowering them. And the notion of that coercive process is kind of in full swing versus someone communicating to someone about, tapping into, hey, I really know I know you really like to play a little bit later. Let's take a look at what's going on in the house. What do we need to do before we can get out to go play? Or we know that you want to go off to college, and let's talk about what are some of the things that you think would be helpful. So it's much more of that collaborative approach, which I would say I feel like I've been doing that throughout my career, and understanding more about PDA kind of as a self prompt to be thinking about that even more for certain individuals. I don't know if Dr. Cruz, if you would say the same. You work a lot with even younger kids, right?
Yeah. I think in terms of, Rose, your initial kind of question around how people are almost receiving it when we're trying to talk about these interventions, I think similarly, I usually try to go from the perspective of any really solid intervention we want to do comes from a trusting relationship. So how is it that we want this individual to feel like they can trust and feel safe in these interactions so that we can promote their autonomy and their skill building? And so for me, that sort of takes the center of the work that I do. And then when we're talking about interventions, whether it's someone with this profile or not, how are we going to tailor it and individualize it to that person? And what seems to make the most sense, and really understanding what is it that we're ultimately working toward. So when I have those conversations with not only teachers but parents, and if they're how we can get on the same page with the parents and the individual with whom we're working.
Yeah, I feel like parent coaching would be a huge part of helping to support a student who might have this type of profile, because as parents, depending on how many kids you have and what your situation is, you get really harried at the end of the day. Maybe you don't have a lot of sleep. But some of these things you're talking about, collaboration over compliance, sounds great. But I think sometimes people probably don't even understand the power of the words that they're saying. Like, you're just massaging the message. Like, the goal is the same. And we want the kids to be independent and autonomous and part of the process. And I think sometimes people don't understand that their words kind of go against all that sometimes, depending on where you're at. I think people don't realize that what they're really saying to their kids and how those things can be triggers for their behavior. And I feel like this is so many different types of kids might potentially have this type of profile. So it's so interesting to talk about. I think another thing that goes along with this is kind of like a student's emotional regulation, which is a big piece to this. So what are some ways that we can support our students with their emotional regulation?
So I think a couple things. It's really important to help with some of the skill building. So one of the things where there's that nuance component is the social skills training. So social emotional learning is critical. Yet we have to be careful, because if you say, all right, guys, get together, we're going to be doing the social skills group, there's also a demand that's implied in there, if not explicit. We're going to be doing role play. So we may be more mindful about doing more incidental kind of teaching. So looking at teaching opportunities to help to develop some of those communication words, to build up some of the identification and expression of feeling words, to be able to help an individual to learn and practice to reset. So role play still is important, and it always has been critical, that behavioral rehearsal. We just have to think about how we can gain a bit more cooperation with the social skills practice and the training of that. But for sure, we'd want to work on the expression of emotions, being able to opt for and take breaks where and when needed, being able to ask for and communicate with a trusted adult where they need help. And a real critical piece is, it's not just moving away from when I'm uncomfortable, but helping that individual to habituate to that over time, that where this situation may evoke some anxiety, some discomfort for me, helping them to become desensitized through that in a very really respectful and empathic way, to gradually help them to experience that discomfort, which is really going to be one of the most effective interventions, is that they become more comfortable with that which is uncomfortable through, again, a compassion and cooperative approach.
That's interesting.
And I'll add to that too. I think at the kind of core is that anxiety management. So how are we really focusing on managing that, whether that's through, things like relaxation techniques. And I think a big piece too with emotion regulation is also how we're showing up. So being able to lend our calm and regulate our own emotions, because if we're really viewing it as this individual is very, very maybe overstimulated, then how are we also showing up to help calm that interaction that we're having? Because when we think about how we're showing up in the interaction, that could only, that could calm things or that can exacerbate whatever is taking place.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of self-reflection on the professional and the teacher. I like emotional intelligence, right? I'm in this like business mastermind, and somebody that I'm in this group with wrote a book on emotional intelligence, and I was like, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure. And I'm like, oh, this goes exactly with like what everybody in the world really needs if they have a job or they're raising a kid, or like how our behavior kind of lends itself to that with our kids. Yeah, that's interesting because the idea of social skills groups, I worked in the middle school, high school level for 10 years. And I loved that age group and loved to think kind of outside of the box on how can we work on some of these things, but very anti, like not going to do a lunch bunch or, ostracize anybody or make somebody pull a friend in. And I liked kind of being and trying to talk with the kids about like, well, why is this important? Because I think a lot of it is kind of saying like, let's be collaborative. Why are these things important? And working on those. We actually just had a BCBA on Rob Harvey talk about he does these groups, social language groups that are using Dungeons and Dragons to work on social language skills. And I was like, oh, that's really fun because it's kind of, it's not like, okay, we're going to go and our topic of the day is, eye contact. And this is what we're going to do and we're going to practice, right? But you can get kind of these embedded opportunities with this outside the box thinking. So I like that idea. Having it more collaborative. Interesting. Now, where can people find out more about PDA? Like, are there any resources that, like, I use ResearchGate a lot just because, I do a lot of CEU courses, have a membership, the ABA Speech Connection and things like that. And also want to like try to share open access articles. But where are people going for information? Are there books or is there research out there from other countries that people are discussing this if people want to learn more?
So again, there's pretty minimal research at this point, but there's fortunately some good open, kind of websites where there are podcasts that are coming within there. There are informational sessions, other webinars, and one where we've seen a lot of good information is from the UK, the pdasociety.org.uk. There's also one in the States, US, and the name of that is escaping me right now, but if we just Google PDA Society or PDA in the United States, and you'll find that's come out over the last several years where they've had a few different actually conferences, which is pretty cool. So increasingly more awareness of that. There also are individuals that are indicating that they're PDA friendly practitioners, which I think can be helpful, which would suggest that they have some awareness about what PDA is and supporting individuals regardless of a diagnosis, but who seem to present with some of the symptomology that we're describing here.
Wonderful. That's great. I love that because I think a lot of people will think of a student that they have or their own child and be like, I need to join that thing. I need to look up that website. Thank you so much for both coming on the show. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
So we are from Behavior Therapy Associates in Somerset, New Jersey, which is north central part of New Jersey. And go to behaviortherapyassociates.com and you'll be able to check out our profiles and the rest of our team, as well as learn about the array of services. So we do provide in-person services in New Jersey, and we provide telehealth services throughout the majority of the states. And we're available to provide consultation as well as the telehealth and evaluations, as well as professional development. So love the opportunity to network and learn from others as much as share the knowledge that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to connect with both of you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.